22,000 feet above the English Channel, the cockpit of the Hawker Typhoon shudders violently. Test pilot Roland Beamont's gloved hands grip the control column, knuckles white beneath leather. The date is May 1943. The altimeter spins counterclockwise like a broken clock. Outside the canopy, the world rotates, sky, sea, in a sickening carousel of blue and gray. The dive angle steepens past 70 degrees. Then 80. The airspeed indicator climbs beyond 450 miles per hour, entering the red zone marked with a single word in stenciled letters: fatal. The airframe screams. Metal groans against rivets. The control surfaces have locked solid, frozen by aerodynamic forces no human strength can overcome. Beamont's vision tunnels. Gray fog creeps inward from the edges. His body weighs 5 times normal, pressed into the seat by gravitational violence. The channel below rushes upward, its surface transforming from texture to detail to individual whitecaps. Every test pilot knows the statistics. Dives beyond terminal velocity are non-survivable. The math is absolute. The physics, unforgiving. He has 11 seconds before impact. The science of falling had become a military obsession by 1940. Across Europe, engineers and pilots wrestled with a fundamental problem that defied simple solutions. How to drop a bomb with precision while traveling at 300 miles per hour, 3 miles above the Earth, with enemy fighters circling and anti-aircraft shells erupting in black flowers across the sky. Horizontal bombing, the standard method, scattered ordnance across acres of countryside. A formation of 12 bombers might place only 2 or 3 bombs within 100 yards of their target. Factories survived. Bridges stood. Rail junctions continued operating. The mathematics of trajectory, wind drift, and target movement created an equation with too many variables. Commanders wanted certainty. They needed a bomber that could put high explosive exactly where it mattered. The answer came from an unlikely source. Ernst Udet, a German fighter ace from the Great War, watched American dive bomber demonstrations in 1931 at a Cleveland air show. The technique mesmerized him. Aircraft rolled into near-vertical descents, released their payload at low altitude, then pulled out in gut-wrenching climbs. The bombs struck within meters of their targets. Udet purchased 2 Curtiss Hawk biplanes with his own money and shipped them to Germany. The Luftwaffe studied Udet's American aircraft obsessively. Dive bombing offered tactical revolution. By approaching targets from directly above, pilots eliminated the horizontal bombing problem entirely. Gravity became an ally. The aircraft itself became the bomb site. Release altitude could be calculated precisely. Wind effects minimized. Target movement became irrelevant when the bomb fell almost straight down. But the technique demanded a terrible price from both machine and pilot. When an aircraft enters a dive steeper than 60 degrees, it accelerates beyond its normal operating envelope. Gravity pulls it toward terminal velocity, the maximum speed achievable in free fall when air resistance equals gravitational force. For a loaded bomber, terminal velocity approached 550 miles per hour. At such speeds, air behaves less like gas and more like liquid. Control surfaces designed for gentle maneuvering suddenly face pressures equivalent to tons per square inch. Ailerons freeze, elevators lock solid, rudders become immovable. The human body fares no better. During the pullout, the desperate climb away from Earth after bomb release, centrifugal force multiplies body weight exponentially. At 6 times gravity, a 180-pound pilot weighs half a ton. Blood drains from the brain toward the feet. Vision narrows, then grays, then blacks out entirely. The heart, designed to pump blood upward against normal gravity, suddenly labors against 6 times that force. Unconsciousness arrives within seconds. Death shortly after. German engineers at Junkers began designing an aircraft specifically for this mission in 1935. The Ju-87, nicknamed Stuka from Sturzkampfflugzeug, dive bomber, featured inverted gull wings that provided ground clearance for an enormous fixed landing gear. Dive brakes mounted under the wings could be deployed to limit terminal velocity. An automatic pull-out system would activate if the pilot lost consciousness during recovery. Test flights began in 1936. 3 pilots died in the first year. The dive brakes created asymmetric drag if deployed unevenly, sending aircraft into uncontrollable spins. The automatic pull-out system activated too late, or not at all, or too violently, snapping wings off at the root. Engineers calculated stress loads, reinforced spars, adjusted angles. More test flights, more modifications, more widows. By 1939, the Stuka had matured into a functional weapon. During the invasion of Poland, Stuka squadrons demolished bridges, shattered tank columns, and broke infantry formations with surgical precision. The aircraft dove at 85 degrees, nearly vertical, sirens wailing through special whistles mounted on the landing gear. The psychological effect proved almost as devastating as the ordnance itself. Soldiers called it the Jericho trumpet. They broke and ran before the bombs even landed. The Luftwaffe had solved the dive bombing equation. The question now facing Britain and America was whether they could match it and whether their pilots could survive the learning process. The Royal Air Force watched the Stuka's performance over Poland and France with professional horror. British bombers, Wellington, Hampton, Blenheim, relied on level flight and hoped for accuracy. Against fixed fortifications or large industrial complexes, this approach sufficed. Against moving columns, coastal shipping, or hardened bunkers, it bordered on useless. Something had to change. The Hawker Typhoon entered service in 1941, originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor to counter German bombers. It failed spectacularly at that role. The engine leaked carbon monoxide into the cockpit. The tail section suffered structural failures at high speed. Early production aircraft killed 11 pilots in 6 months from causes unrelated to enemy action. The Air Ministry considered canceling the entire program. Then engineers discovered something unexpected. The Typhoon could dive, not cautiously, not carefully, but violently, aggressively, past speeds that tore other fighters apart. The thick wing roots and robust fuselage frame, originally intended to support high-altitude performance, could withstand forces that liquefied less sturdy aircraft. Below 15,000 feet, where its Napier Sabre engine breathed properly, the Typhoon became brutally fast. Someone suggested weaponizing this characteristic. If the aircraft could survive extreme dives, perhaps it could deliver bombs and rockets with Stuka-like precision. The concept made tactical sense. German forces had learned to scatter when they heard Stuka sirens. They had not yet learned to fear the howl of a Typhoon in a power dive. The Air Ministry established the Fighter Experimental Unit at Boscombe Down in southern England. Test pilots received a straightforward mandate: determine exactly how far the Typhoon could be pushed before structural failure. Find the edge, map it precisely, then teach operational pilots to work right up to that edge without crossing it. Roland Beamont arrived at Boscombe Down in early 1943, 23 years old, already a squadron leader, already an ace with multiple confirmed kills against Luftwaffe fighters. He possessed the peculiar combination of aggression and precision that made exceptional test pilots, the willingness to deliberately seek situations that would kill most men, while maintaining the clinical detachment to record data throughout the experience. The test protocol was methodical. Begin at 15,000 feet. Establish a 30-degree dive. Record control response, airspeed buildup, and structural vibration. Land, debrief, repeat at 45 degrees. Then 60, then 70. Each dive pushed deeper into unknown aerodynamic territory. Each dive produced data points no wind tunnel could replicate. By May 1943, Beamont had logged 47 high-speed test dives in Typhoon R7881. The aircraft bore chalk marks on its fuselage, one for each flight that exceeded the manufacturer's recommended limits. Engineering teams examined every rivet after each landing. Stress cracks appeared along wing roots. Fuselage skin buckled near the tail assembly. Each damaged component was photographed, measured, cataloged, then reinforced. The test schedule for May 11th was routine by Beamont's standards. 6 dives from 22,000 feet, each at progressively steeper angles. The goal: determine maximum controllable dive angle before elevator authority disappeared entirely. Previous flights suggested the threshold lay somewhere near 75 degrees. Today's mission would find it. Weather conditions were ideal. Clear skies, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. The channel stretched below like hammered pewter, its surface calm enough to see individual fishing boats as tiny white dots against gray-blue water. Beamont completed the pre-flight inspection personally, running gloved hands along control surfaces, checking hydraulic lines, testing aileron response. He climbed into the cockpit at airweight 47 hours. Ground crew strapped him in, connected oxygen lines, closed the canopy. The Napier Sabre engine coughed once, twice, then settled into its characteristic aggressive rumble, 24 cylinders arranged in an H pattern, producing 2,200 horsepower. The sound resonated through the airframe, through Beamont's seat, through his chest cavity. Tower cleared him for takeoff at 0852. The Typhoon accelerated down the runway, rotated, climbed. Beamont leveled at 22,000 feet and trimmed for straight flight. The channel spread beneath him. France lay invisible beyond the southern horizon. He began his pre-dive checklist, methodically confirming each instrument reading, each control response, each system status. At precisely 0921 hours, he rolled inverted and pulled the stick back toward his chest. The Typhoon's nose dropped toward vertical. The final dive anyone expected him to survive, had begun. What happened in the next 90 seconds would rewrite the operational limits of every dive-capable aircraft in the Allied inventory. Angle 1. The human element. Psychology of the terminal dive test pilots exist in a psychological space that most humans never approach. They volunteer to explore the exact conditions that kill people. Every morning briefing discusses failure modes in clinical language. Flutter, compressibility, structural disintegration, but everyone in the room understands these terms translate to violent death. The work requires a particular mental architecture, the ability to maintain analytical thought while the brainstem screams for survival. Beamont's generation learned flying during wartime, when aircraft killed students as routinely as enemy fighters. Training fatalities were expected, almost normalized. A class of 30 pilots might graduate 22. The missing 8 weren't commemorated with elaborate ceremony. Their names appeared on lists. Their belongings were packed. New students took their beds. This created a cohort desensitized to mortality in ways peacetime aviators never experience. But desensitization differs from fearlessness. Beamont felt fear during every test dive, a cold awareness running beneath conscious thought, monitoring escape options, calculating bailout altitudes, tracking the distance to terminal impact. The fear served as data. Too much fear created hesitation. Hesitation in a high-speed dive meant lost control authority and death. Too little fear bred carelessness. Carelessness meant missing warning signs until recovery became impossible. The ideal state was controlled fear, acknowledged, cataloged, then filed away while the hands and eyes continued their work. Each dive required a pre-commitment to accept death if the aircraft failed. Parachutes were useless below 3,000 feet. Ejection seats didn't exist. If the Typhoon broke apart or entered an unrecoverable spin, Beamont would ride the wreckage down, conscious and aware, for approximately 15 seconds before impact. He knew this, accepted it, climbed into the cockpit anyway. This wasn't courage in the conventional sense, it was something stranger, colder, more clinical. Angle 2. The physics of death. Terminal velocity mechanics. The mathematics of a terminal dive are brutally simple. An object falling through atmosphere accelerates at 32 feet per second squared until air resistance equals gravitational force. For a Typhoon in a vertical dive, terminal velocity approached 550 miles per hour, approximately 800 feet per second. At 22,000 feet altitude, reaching terminal velocity required approximately 30 seconds of uninterrupted descent. But terminal velocity was not the primary killer. The pullout was. To recover from a vertical dive, a pilot must convert vertical motion into horizontal motion, essentially turning the aircraft 90 degrees while traveling at maximum speed. This maneuver generates centrifugal force proportional to velocity squared divided by turn radius. The tighter the turn, the greater the g-force. The faster the aircraft, the greater the g-force. Physics offers no compromise, no negotiation. At 500 miles per hour, a pull-out radius of 800 feet generates 9 times gravity. Beamont weighed 170 pounds. At 9 Gs, his body weighed 1,530 pounds. His heart, approximately 11 ounces, suddenly weighed 6 pounds. Blood weighs roughly 8 pounds per gallon. Pulling that blood upward from legs to brain against 9 Gs requires pressure. The cardiovascular system simply cannot generate. Blackout occurs when blood pressure at eye level drops below approximately 20 millimeters of mercury. At 6 Gs, most pilots lose peripheral vision, the condition called gray out. At 7 Gs, central vision fails, full blackout. At 8 Gs, G-induced loss of consciousness occurs, G-loc, where the pilot remains physically alive but mentally absent. At 9 Gs, sustained for more than 3 seconds, blood vessels in the brain rupture. Stroke. Death. The Typhoon's airframe could theoretically survive 12 Gs before structural failure. The human body could not. This created a grotesque paradox. The aircraft could pull tight enough to tear itself apart, but the pilot would die first, slumped unconscious in the cockpit while the airframe remained intact during impact. Engineers calculated minimum recovery altitudes based on these forces. From terminal velocity at 85 degrees, assuming immediate pull-out initiation and optimal technique, a pilot needed 4,000 feet minimum. Below that threshold, physics allowed no survival scenario. The math was absolute. Angle 3. Engineering challenges. Control Surface Authority aircraft designers in 1943 worked within pre-computer constraints. Wind tunnel testing provided approximations. Scale models offered rough data. But nothing replicated the precise aerodynamic conditions of a full-scale aircraft at 500 miles per hour in a near-vertical attitude. Every operational envelope was ultimately mapped by human beings willing to fly into unknown territory and report back, assuming they survived. The Typhoon's control system was entirely mechanical. No hydraulics, no power assist. Cables ran from the control column in the cockpit to elevator surfaces at the tail. When Beamont pulled back on the stick, he was physically pulling steel cables that physically moved the elevator. The force required depended entirely on air pressure against the control surface. At cruising speed, 300 miles per hour, the system required moderate effort. A fit pilot could maintain control indefinitely. At 400 miles per hour, control forces doubled. At 450, they tripled. At 500 miles per hour, pulling the stick back far enough to initiate a recovery required. Approximately 120 pounds of force, the equivalent of doing a pull-up while experiencing 6 times body weight. But force was only half the problem. Control effectiveness was the other half. An elevator works by changing the angle of airflow across its surface, creating upward or downward pressure on the tail, which rotates the aircraft around its center of gravity. This principle functions predictably within the aircraft's designed speed range. Beyond that range, unexpected aerodynamic effects emerge. Compressibility, the behavior of air at near-sonic speeds, creates shock waves across the elevator surface. These shock waves disrupt smooth airflow, reducing control effectiveness by 50% or more. An elevator deflection that produces 6 Gs at 400 miles per hour might produce only 3 Gs at 500 miles per hour. The pilot pulls harder, achieves less result. Flutter presented an even deadlier risk. At specific speed and angle combinations, control surfaces begin oscillating, vibrating rapidly between deflected and neutral positions. The oscillations build upon themselves, frequency increasing, amplitude growing until the control surface tears itself free from the airframe. Flutter had killed more test pilots than any other single cause. It arrived without warning, developed faster than human reaction time, and offered no recovery procedure. The aircraft simply disintegrated. Every test dive was, fundamentally, an experiment in whether these engineering nightmares would manifest. Beamont was both scientist and subject, observer and specimen. And on May 11, 1943, at 09:21 hours, all 3 nightmares arrived simultaneously. Angle 4, tactical importance. The dive-bombing doctrine gap by mid-1943. The tactical air war had evolved into a contest of precision versus survival. The Luftwaffe's Stuka squadrons, once devastatingly effective over Poland and France, had been slaughtered over Britain. RAF fighters discovered that dive bombers, committed to their attack runs, became nearly defenseless targets. Dozens of Stukas fell to Spitfires and Hurricanes during the summer of 1940. The Germans withdrew them from Western operations, but the tactical need remained. Allied ground forces advancing through North Africa and preparing for European invasion required close air support. Aircraft that could strike individual tanks, gun emplacements, and fortified positions with precision. Traditional medium bombers, flying at 12,000 feet and releasing bombs horizontally, destroyed city blocks when commanders needed them to destroy bunkers. The margin for error was measured in hundreds of yards. Friendly forces died from friendly bombs with depressing regularity. American doctrine favored dedicated dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntless, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, but these were naval aircraft designed for carrier operations against ships. They lacked the speed, armor, and firepower to survive over defended ground targets in occupied Europe. RAF doctrine had never included dive bombers at all. British military thinking categorized air power into strategic bombing and fighter interception, with little middle ground. The Typhoon represented a compromise solution, a fighter bomber that could defend itself, then attack ground targets with dive-delivered weapons, then fight its way home. But only if pilots could master the dive attack profile without killing themselves in the process. The tactical doctrine depended entirely on understanding the aircraft's actual limits, not the theoretical limits derived from engineering calculations. Beamont's test program existed to provide that understanding. Every dive generated data that would be distributed to operational squadrons. Every successful recovery technique would be taught to combat pilots. Every failure mode discovered in testing was one fewer failure mode that would kill men over France. The individual test flight mattered less than the aggregate knowledge it produced. This created a moral calculus that Beamont rarely discussed but clearly understood. His death during testing might save 50 pilots in operational service. Risk to one individual protected the collective. It was not heroism in the classical sense. It was actuarial logic applied to human lives. Angle 5. The enemy's advantage. German dive attack mastery. The Luftwaffe had purchased its dive bombing expertise in blood during the Spanish Civil War. Condor Legion pilots tested Stuka prototypes against Republican forces in 1937 and 1938, refining techniques through trial and fatal error. By September 1939, German dive bomber doctrine was mature, proven, and utterly ruthless. Stuka pilots trained for 6 months specifically for dive bombing, twice the duration of standard fighter training. They practiced on specially constructed ranges with simulated targets, dropping cement-filled practice bombs from progressively steeper angles. Training aircraft were fitted with altitude-triggered alarms that screamed when the pilot descended below minimum recovery altitude. The message was explicit. Pull out now or die. Operational Stuka units achieved hit rates exceeding 70%, a precision level Allied horizontal bombers could not approach. During the French campaign, single Stuka squadrons destroyed entire tank columns, turning armored advances into burning wreckage within minutes. The psychological effect multiplied the physical destruction. French soldiers abandoned defensive positions when they heard the Jericho sirens even before bombs fell. But German success created British urgency. If the war moved to ground combat in Europe, when not if, Allied forces would face Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft operating with years of combat experience. British and American pilots would be learning dive attack techniques while being shot at by men who had mastered those techniques long ago. The knowledge gap represented a tactical disadvantage measured in lives. Closing that gap required 2 parallel efforts: developing aircraft capable of surviving extreme dive attacks, and training pilots to execute those attacks without killing themselves. Beamont's work at Boscombe Down addressed the first requirement. His survival would inform the second. Angle 6. Innovation under pressure. Experimental solutions. Test flying in wartime operated under constraints that peacetime programs never faced. There was no time for methodical incremental testing. No luxury of grounding an aircraft type for 6 months while engineers analyzed data and redesigned components. Combat operations continued regardless of test results. Pilots flew operational missions in aircraft whose limits remained unknown, discovering those limits through fatal accidents. The Fighter Experimental Unit developed shortcuts, dangerous, pragmatic methods to accelerate knowledge acquisition. One technique involved progressive boundary exploration. A test pilot would fly to a specific condition, say, a 70-degree dive at 450 miles per hour, and note exactly what happened to control forces, structural vibration, and recovery characteristics. The next flight would push slightly further, 72 degrees or 460 miles per hour. Each flight added one data point to an expanding map of survivable conditions. This approach accepted a fundamental risk. Eventually, one flight would cross the boundary from survivable to unsurvivable. The pilot would have perhaps 2 seconds to recognize the transition before physics made survival impossible. There was no other way. Wind tunnels couldn't replicate full-scale high-speed flight. Mathematical models were approximations. Only actual flight testing revealed actual limits. Beamont kept a private notebook, a small leather-bound journal where he recorded observations too detailed or speculative for official reports. Notes about control feel, about the specific quality of airframe vibration just before flutter onset, about the subjective sensation of approaching the edge. He understood that if he died, this notebook might teach his replacement how to survive the next test flight. Other innovations were mechanical. Ground crews developed ad hoc modifications based on test pilot feedback. Reinforcement plates welded to stress points, control cable tension adjustments, modified elevator trim tabs. These changes received no formal engineering approval, no exhaustive testing protocol. They were implemented because they might help, and there was no time for certainty. The entire system operated on pragmatic fatalism. Everyone involved understood that test pilots would die. The goal was to minimize those deaths while maximizing knowledge gained from each one. It was brutal calculus, but it was honest calculus. And on May 11th, when Beamont's Typhoon rolled into its 78th degree dive at 22,000 feet, that accumulated knowledge would be tested against physics in real time, with his life as the measuring instrument. The dive begins as choreography, practiced, deliberate, controlled. Beamont rolls inverted at 22,000 feet, the channel rotating above his canopy where sky should be. He pulls the stick back smoothly, feeling the nose drop through horizontal toward the vertical. The altimeter begins unwinding. 21,000! 20,000! The airspeed indicator climbs past 300 miles per hour. At 70 degrees, the angle feels manageable. Steep, aggressive, but within familiar territory. He's dived at this angle 40 times before. The control column requires firm pressure but remains responsive. Elevator authority feels normal. Airframe vibration stays within acceptable limits. He makes a mental note. 70 degrees, clean entry, no anomalies, then he pushes further. 75 degrees. The nose drops until the horizon disappears entirely from view. Only water fills the windscreen now. Gray-blue channel expanding in all directions, individual whitecaps beginning to resolve into detail. The altimeter spins faster, 18,000 feet, 17,000. Airspeed climbs through 350 miles per hour. The control column hardens. What required 30 pounds of pull force at cruising speed now demands 60. Beamont's forearms tense against the resistance. He maintains the dive angle, not pulling out yet, gathering data, fulfilling the test protocol. Structural vibration increases. A buzz transmitted through the seat, through the stick, through his bones. Still acceptable. Still survivable. At 78 degrees, everything changes. The buffeting transforms from vibration into violence. The entire airframe shudders as if struck by invisible hammers. Beamont's head snaps forward against the restraint straps. His vision blurs from the pounding. The windscreen flexes in its frame. 400 miles per hour. 15,000 feet. He pulls back on the stick to begin recovery. Nothing happens. The control column might as well be welded in place. Beamont pulls harder, engaging shoulders and back, full strength. The column moves perhaps half an inch, then stops against aerodynamic pressure that no human muscle can overcome. The elevator surfaces, 30 feet behind him at the tail, are pressed flat against their stops by air moving at 420 miles per hour. They will not move. Cannot move. 14,000 feet. Training takes over. When elevator authority fails, try aileron roll. If he can roll the aircraft wings level while in the dive, the vertical angle becomes less severe. Less severe means less speed buildup. Less speed might restore control authority. It's a long-shot technique, barely mentioned in training, but it's the only option remaining. Beamont pushes the stick left. The ailerons respond, barely. The Typhoon rolls perhaps 10 degrees, then stops. The ailerons, like the elevator, have encountered air pressure beyond their design limits. 10 degrees of roll is useless. He needs 90 degrees. He pushes harder. Nothing. 13,000 feet. 435 miles per hour. The buffeting intensifies into something beyond turbulence. A sustained hammering that sounds like the airframe is tearing itself apart. A rivet pops somewhere in the fuselage behind him. He hears it clearly over the engine roar and wind scream. Then another. The Typhoon is beginning to disintegrate from aerodynamic forces. Gray fog creeps into his peripheral vision. G-forces during the dive are building despite the angle remaining constant, simply from velocity increase. His body weighs twice normal, then 3 times. Blood drains toward his feet. His legs feel swollen, overfilled. His head feels light, empty. 12,000 feet. Beamont tries the rudder, a desperation move with no aerodynamic logic behind it. The rudder pedals might as well be concrete blocks. Nothing moves. The aircraft is a ballistic object now, a 6-ton projectile falling under gravity's absolute control. He is a passenger strapped inside that projectile, watching altitude disappear, watching the channel's surface transform from texture to topography. 11,000 feet. 440 miles per hour. At this speed and angle, he has approximately 24 seconds until impact. The mathematics are merciless. At 440 miles per hour, 645 feet per second, 11,000 feet disappears in 17 seconds. But he won't have 17 seconds because he's still accelerating. Terminal velocity for a Typhoon in vertical dive is approximately 550 miles per hour. He'll reach that speed around 8,000 feet, then maintain it for the remaining descent. Time to impact, 20 seconds. His breathing remains steady, training overriding panic. Oxygen flows into his mask. His hands stay on the controls despite their uselessness. He does not reach for the canopy release, because bailout at this altitude and speed is impossible. The slipstream would rip him apart. Better to stay strapped in, aware, present for whatever comes next. 10,000 feet. The channel below is no longer abstract. He can see fishing boats, individual waves, dark patches where deeper water runs. In 20 seconds, his aircraft will strike that surface at terminal velocity. The impact will be instantaneous. He will not feel it. The Typhoon will compress into debris spanning 50 yards of water. His body will be unrecognizable. He considers his family, his squadron mates, the ground crew who painted chalk marks on this fuselage, the engineers who will analyze the wreckage. His notebook, leather-bound, still in his jacket pocket, containing observations about control feel and vibration onset. Perhaps it will survive. Perhaps it will help the next pilot. 9,000 feet. Then, in that instant between acceptance and impact, Beamont notices something. The buffeting has changed character. Still violent, still hammering, but different. Less chaotic. More rhythmic. The frequency has shifted. And the control column, immobile for the past 6,000 feet, has moved slightly. Not from his pulling, he stopped pulling at 11,000 feet, conserving strength for no reason except habit. The column moved on its own, 8,000 feet. 490 miles per hour. He pulls again. Gently this time, testing. The column shifts backward perhaps an inch. Not much, not enough. But it moved. Which means the elevator has regained minimal authority. Which means airspeed might be decreasing, or angle might be shallowing, or something has changed in the aerodynamic equation. 7,500 feet. Beamont understands what's happening. The Typhoon is transitioning through compressibility, the speed range where air begins behaving non-linearly, where shock waves form and collapse across the airframe. On the downward side of that transition, control surfaces stop working. On the upward side, they start working again. He's crossed the boundary, climbed back out of the abyss not through any action of his own, but because he fell so far, so fast, that he passed completely through the danger zone. But understanding this provides no comfort. 7,500 feet is still too low. Even with partial control authority restored, pulling out from near-terminal velocity requires altitude he no longer has. He pulls the control column with everything remaining: arms, shoulders, back, core. The column moves back 6 inches. The nose begins to rise, imperceptibly at first. Then, with gathering momentum, the horizon reappears at the top edge of the windscreen. Water and sky separate 6,000 feet. G-forces slam into him like a physical blow. 4 Gs, 5, 6, his vision grays instantly. Peripheral vision disappears into fog. He maintains pressure on the stick through pure muscle memory. 7 Gs. Blackout arrives. He remains conscious, barely, operating on autonomic response and training so deeply ingrained it functions without thought. Keep pulling. Don't ease off. Ride it through. The altimeter slows its mad counterclockwise spin. 5,000 feet. The rate of descent decreases. 4,000 feet. The Typhoon is transitioning from vertical dive to steep descent. Still falling, still too fast, but no longer ballistic. 8 Gs. Something tears in Beamont's chest. A muscle, a ligament. He doesn't know and can't spare attention to check. His vision is a gray tunnel with a pinpoint of clarity at the center. The horizon is visible through that pinpoint, climbing higher in the windscreen. The nose rising, 3,000 feet. His vision begins returning. Color bleeds back into the gray. The channel below rushes upward, individual waves now clearly visible, fishing boats close enough to see details. Too close. Much too close. 2,500 feet. The Typhoon is level. Not climbing yet, but level. Still traveling at 420 miles per hour, but horizontally now instead of vertically. The engine screams at maximum RPM. The airframe shudders with damage. Something drags behind the aircraft. A piece of fuselage skin torn loose, flapping in the slipstream. Beamont eases back pressure on the stick. The nose begins climbing. Slowly, grudgingly. He's still barely subsonic, still carrying enormous speed, but altitude is increasing. 2,700 feet, 2,900 feet, 3,000 feet. He's alive. The climb feels fragile, temporary, as if physics might revoke survival at any moment. Beamont maintains gentle back pressure on the control column, coaxing the Typhoon upward through 3,500 feet, then 4,000. His vision has fully returned, but his arms shake with exhaustion. The pull force required during the recovery pulled something deep in his shoulder. Each breath brings sharp pain across his ribs. The airspeed bleeds off gradually. 400 miles per hour, 380. The aircraft handles sluggishly, damaged in ways not yet apparent. Something vibrates behind the cockpit, a structural component flexing where it should be rigid. The rudder pedals feel loose, feedback diminished. He wiggles the stick experimentally. Aileron response is asymmetric. The left wing drops more readily than the right. At 6,000 feet, Beamont begins the assessment process. The pre-crash comm gives way to analytical inventory. Physical condition, functioning, but compromised. Pain in chest, shoulder, neck. Vision clear. Hands responsive despite tremor. Mental state, sharp enough. The aircraft, airworthy ? Engine temperature's normal. Oil pressure good. Hydraulics. No hydraulics in the control system to fail. Fuel sufficient for return to Boscombe Down. He banks gently toward the English coast, 15 miles north. The turn requires twice the usual stick input. The Typhoon wallows through the maneuver like a truck on ice. Definitely damaged. The question is whether the damage will allow landing or mandate bailout over land. Radio check. He keys the microphone. Boscombe Tower, this is Typhoon R7881. Do you read? Static. Then, R7881, Boscombe Tower reads you clearly. Your transmission was interrupted 12 minutes ago. Confirm status. 12 minutes. The dive, the recovery, the climb, all of it consumed 12 minutes. It felt like hours. R7881 experiencing control difficulties following test dive. Damage assessment in progress. Request priority landing. R7881, you are cleared priority approach runway 27. Wind is calm. Fire equipment standing by, fire equipment. Standard protocol, but the words carry weight. Ground crews anticipate a crash landing. They're positioning foam trucks and ambulances. Beamont checks fuel quantity again. Sufficient for one approach. No second chances. The English coastline materializes ahead. Chalk cliffs, green fields, the familiar patchwork of southeast England. He crosses the beach at 5,000 feet, airspeed down to 280 miles per hour. The Typhoon feels increasingly unstable. A rhythmic vibration has developed in the tail section, frequency matching engine RPM. Flutter precursor. If it develops into true flutter, the tail will separate and the aircraft will tumble. Beamont reduces throttle gradually. Less power, less vibration. The trade-off. Less power means less airspeed, which brings the aircraft closer to stall speed. With damaged control surfaces, recovering from a stall might be impossible. He's balancing on a knife edge between too fast and too slow. With no margin for error, Boscombe Down appears ahead. Grass runways forming an X. Control tower on the eastern boundary. Hangars scattered along the southern edge. He can see fire trucks positioned along the runway, 3 of them red against green grass. An ambulance parked beside the tower. Personnel gathered in small clusters, watching. R7881 entering downwind for runway 27. R7881 cleared to land. Surface wind calm, altimeter 299er2. The landing pattern requires 4 turns. Downwind leg parallel to the runway, base leg perpendicular. Final approach aligned with the runway. Each turn stresses damaged control surfaces. Each turn risks structural failure. Beamont flies the pattern wider than usual, reducing bank angle, minimizing stress. Downwind leg complete. He lowers the landing gear. 3 green lights, gear down, and locked. Small mercy. At least the gear mechanism survived. Flaps next. He extends them incrementally, watching for asymmetric deployment. They extend evenly. Another small mercy. Base leg turn. The Typhoon banks 20 degrees, shutters, completes the turn. Vibration intensifies briefly, then subsides. Final approach begins. The runway stretches ahead, grass surface marked with white boundary lines. Beamont is high and fast, 600 feet at 180 miles per hour. Normally, he'd dive to lose altitude quickly. Today, diving is not an option. He reduces power further, raises the nose slightly, accepts the prolonged approach. 500 feet, 170 miles per hour. Still too fast. The runway appears to shrink, perspective compressing distance. He'll land long, perhaps too long. The runway is 3,000 feet. At 170 miles per hour, 250 feet per second, he'll consume most of that length before stopping. 400 feet. He's committed. No go-around possible. The engine might not accept sudden power increase. The damaged airframe might not tolerate the maneuver. Land or crash. No third option. 300 feet. The fire trucks are clearly visible now, crews standing beside them in protective gear. Faces turned upward. Watching 200 feet. Beamont feels the aircraft dropping toward stall. The controls feel mushy, response delayed. Airspeed has decayed to 165 miles per hour. 15 miles per hour above stall speed with flaps extended. He adds a fraction of power. The engine responds smoothly. Small mercy again, 100 feet. The runway rises to meet him. Windsock on the tower hangs limp, truly calm conditions. The Typhoon descends through ground effect, that cushion of compressed air between wings and earth. The sink rate decreases. 50 feet, he pulls power to idle, flares gently. The tail settles. Main wheels contact grass with a thump that reverberates through the damaged airframe. The tail wheel drops, all 3 wheels rolling now. Brakes applied gradually. The Typhoon decelerates, 2,000 feet of runway remaining. 1,500, 1,000. The aircraft slows below 100 miles per hour. Controllable now. Normal. He steers toward the runway edge, away from fire trucks, giving ground crews clear access if something ignites. 500 feet remaining. 70 miles per hour. The Typhoon rolls to a stop with 200 feet of runway to spare. Beamont sits in the cockpit, engine still running at idle, hands resting on the control column. He is breathing hard. The pain in his chest has intensified, definitely cracked ribs, possibly worse. His shoulder throbs. His vision seems unnaturally bright, colors oversaturated, edges too sharp. Adrenaline aftermath. Fire crews approach cautiously, checking for fuel leaks, for fire, for structural damage visible from outside. A crew chief appears beside the cockpit, climbing onto the wing root, peering through the canopy. Beamont gives him a thumbs up. The crew chief's expression suggests he doesn't believe it. Beamont shuts down the engine. The Napier Sabre coughs once and goes silent. Sudden quiet, broken only by wind and distant voices and the tick of cooling metal. He releases his harness straps, opens the canopy. Cool air floods the cockpit, carrying the smell of grass and aviation fuel. Climbing out requires help. His legs don't quite function properly, a combination of exhaustion, G-force trauma, and relief that bypasses conscious control. 2 ground crew members steady him as he descends from the wing. His boots touch earth, solid, stationary earth. He stands for a moment, confirming that standing is possible. The Typhoon sits behind him, chalk marks on its fuselage. 48 now, counting today. Except today deserves more than a single mark. Today deserves documentation, analysis, testimony. Today just rewrote the operational limits for every dive-capable fighter in the Royal Air Force inventory. An engineering officer approaches, clipboard in hand, face pale. "Sir, we lost radio contact for nearly 8 minutes. Telemetry showed vertical dive past terminal velocity. We were preparing a crash investigation team." Beamont manages a thin smile. "Bit premature. Aircraft is damaged but recoverable. I'll need to debrief while details are fresh." "Immediately, sir. Medical officer is standing by as well. Medical can wait. Debrief first. I need to record what happened while I still remember the sequence clearly." They walk toward the operations building, Beamont moving stiffly, crew chief on one side ready to provide support if needed. Behind them, engineers swarm the Typhoon, examining airframe, photographing damage, measuring stress cracks. The aircraft will be studied for weeks, every rivet, every weld, every surface. But the most critical data doesn't exist in the airframe. It exists in Beamont's memory. The sensation of controls locking, of altitude disappearing, of recovery beginning impossibly late and succeeding impossibly. That data cannot be measured with instruments or captured in photographs. It exists only in the mind of a pilot who descended to 490 miles per hour in a vertical dive and returned to describe it. 20 minutes later, in the debriefing room, Beamont begins dictating his report. His voice is steady. His recall, precise. The facts align into narrative. Entry angle, speed buildup, control loss, compressibility effects, partial recovery, final landing. No embellishment, no drama, just clinical description of aerodynamic phenomena observed during terminal velocity dive. The intelligence officer recording the debriefing stops writing at one point, looks up. "Sir, you're describing conditions that should have resulted in structural failure and pilot unconsciousness." "Yes, but you recovered. Obviously. How?" Beamont considers the question. How did he survive? Luck. Timing. The specific aerodynamic characteristics of the Typhoon airframe at transonic speeds. His own endurance under extreme G-forces. Muscle memory from 47 previous dives. Some combination of all these factors assembled by chance into a survivable sequence. "I don't know," he says finally. "But now we know it's possible. And if it's possible once, it can be made possible reliably. That's what the next test phase will determine." The intelligence officer writes this down, underlines it. Because this is the critical insight, survival is no longer theoretical. It's proven. The envelope has been expanded. Other pilots, following Beamont's technique, can now explore conditions previously considered fatal. The cost of that knowledge was one pilot experiencing 12 minutes of sustained certainty that he would die. It was one aircraft stressed to the edge of disintegration. It was 20 seconds between 5,000 feet and 2,500 feet where physics almost won, but physics didn't win. Beamont did, and that makes all the difference. The medical examination takes place in a converted hangar that serves as Boscombe Down's flight surgeon facility. Beamont sits on an examination table while a doctor probes his torso with practiced fingers. Each touch produces sharp pain. 3 ribs cracked on the right side, stress fractures from G-force compression. Deep tissue bruising across the shoulders where harness straps bore the weight of 8 times his body mass. Burst capillaries in both eyes, turning the whites pink with blood. Minor vision disturbances that should resolve within 48 hours. The doctor listens to his heart. Elevated rate but regular rhythm. Blood pressure elevated but not dangerously so. Lung sounds clear despite the rib damage. He asks about blackout duration. Beamont estimates 3 to 4 seconds, brief enough to maintain minimal awareness, long enough to lose detailed memory of the recovery's most critical phase. You shouldn't fly for a minimum of 2 weeks, the doctor says, writing notes in a medical file. Possibly 4 depending on rib healing. Any high-G maneuver risks pneumothorax, collapsed lung. At altitude, that's fatal, Beamont nods. He expected this. The test program will continue without him for now, assigned to junior pilots who will stay well inside the boundaries he just mapped. No one will attempt a 78-degree dive until engineering completes their analysis. Probably no one will attempt it even after the analysis. Today's flight wasn't testing, it was survival. By 1400 hours, engineers have completed their preliminary assessment of Typhoon R7881. The aircraft is towed into a hangar and positioned under bright work lights. Inspection reveals damage beyond what external examination suggested. 16 rivets failed along the fuselage spine. 2 elevator hinge fittings cracked. The rudder actuator cable stretched by 3/4 of an inch, not broken, but permanently deformed. Stress cracks radiate from the wing root attachment points, hairline fractures in the main spar. Most critically, examination of the tail section reveals early-stage flutter damage. The vertical stabilizer's internal structure shows deformation consistent with high-frequency oscillation. Another 10 seconds in the dive, perhaps 15, and the tail would have separated completely. The aircraft's survival was measured in seconds, not minutes. The chief engineer photographs everything. Each crack, each failed rivet, each deformation. These images will circulate to Hawker Aircraft's design bureau, to engineering schools, to other test facilities. The damage pattern tells a story about material. Behavior under extreme stress, a story that cannot be replicated in laboratory conditions, a stress analysis. Specialist measures deflection in the elevator, control surfaces. They're warped, subtly, but measurably, from aerodynamic pressure that exceeded design limits by 40%. The specialist calculates that Beamont was pulling approximately 130 pounds of force on the control column during recovery. For a sustained pull of 6 seconds, that represents extraordinary physical output under crushing G-forces. He shouldn't have been able to maintain that force, the specialist tells his team. At 7 Gs, most pilots can barely lift their arms. He was executing a full-body pull equivalent to a weighted chin-up while experiencing 7.5 times body weight. The data is recorded, analyzed, compared against previous test flights. A pattern emerges. Control forces increase exponentially past 450 miles per hour. But then plateau around 500 miles per hour, not because aerodynamic pressure decreases, but because control surfaces reach maximum deflection and physically cannot move further. This plateau creates a brief window where recovery becomes possible, assuming the pilot has strength to maintain pressure and altitude to complete the maneuver. Beamont's dive entered this window at 8,000 feet. Most pilots would have entered it at 4,000 feet or lower, too late for recovery. His unusual entry angle, combined with specific aircraft trim settings, created early entry into the survivable regime. Luck, technique, aerodynamic chance, all three conspired toward survival. By evening, word of the dive has spread through Boscombe Down and beyond. Test pilots from other squadrons stop by operations to hear details. Engineers request clarification on specific data points. The incident becomes immediate legend. Beamont's 8,000-foot dive, spoken with the mixture of respect and disbelief reserved for events that shouldn't have been survivable. 3 days later, Beamont submits his formal written report. 12 pages, technical language throughout. No dramatic embellishment. He describes control response at various dive angles, quantifies the onset of compressibility effects, documents the recovery sequence with precise altitude and airspeed callouts. The prose is clinical, almost boring, which is precisely the point. Test reports document facts, not feelings. but embedded in the technical language is information that will save lives. Specific techniques for managing control forces at extreme speed. Recognition cues for approaching the compressibility boundary. Recovery procedures for regaining control authority after apparent loss. Minimum altitude requirements for survival, much lower than previous calculations suggested, but only if specific conditions align. The Royal Air Force circulates the report to operational Typhoon squadrons within 2 weeks. Pilots read it during briefings, discuss it over meals, internalize its lessons. When they dive on German positions in occupied France, they'll carry Beamont's knowledge with them, awareness that the aircraft can survive conditions previously thought fatal, and precise understanding of how to exploit that capability. Typhoon R7881 never flies again. The airframe damage is too extensive for economical repair. The aircraft is stripped of useful components, engine, instruments, guns, and the fuselage is relegated to instructional use. Ground crews use it to teach maintenance procedures. Engineering students examine its battle scars from aerodynamic warfare, but 47 other Typhoons continue flying. And now they fly with expanded operational limits. Dive angles increase from 60 degrees to 75 degrees. Attack speeds climb from 350 miles per hour to 420. Pilots push harder, strike more precisely, survive encounters that would have killed them before May 11, 1943. The tactical impact manifests within months. Typhoon squadrons operating over France demonstrate Stuka-like precision against hardened targets. Railway bridges destroyed with single bomb strikes. Tank columns shattered by rocket attacks from near-vertical dives. German forces that once feared only dedicated dive bombers now face fighter bombers executing the same tactics with greater speed and survivability. Luftwaffe after-action reports note the change. Interrogation transcripts from captured German pilots contain references to vertical attack fighters, acknowledgement that Allied tactical air power has closed the dive bombing gap. The advantage German forces held since 1939 has eroded. Parity is approaching, and it began with one pilot, one aircraft, one dive that should have ended in a crash investigation, but instead became a data point that redefined possible. 6 weeks after the dive, Beamont returns to flight status. The ribs have healed sufficiently for low-G operations. He begins with routine test flights, cruise performance, fuel consumption, radio checks, rebuilding confidence in his body's response to flight. No dives, not yet. The doctors are explicit. High-G maneuvers remain prohibited for another month minimum, but the test program continues without pause. Other pilots at Boscombe Down incorporate Beamont's findings into their protocols. The dive profiles are adjusted, entry angles limited to 72 degrees, minimum recovery altitude raised to 6,000 feet. These constraints reflect lessons bought at the edge of survival. Push the envelope, but not past the point where physics offers no escape. By August 1943, operational Typhoon squadrons report measurably improved combat effectiveness. Mission success rates for ground attack operations climb from 48% to 63%. The difference is dive bombing precision. Pilots now attack from steep angles at high speed, release ordnance at low altitude, pull out violently. The technique is devastating against point targets. Gun emplacements, ammunition dumps, command posts. German defensive doctrine adapts slowly. Anti-aircraft batteries trained to track level bombers struggle against targets approaching at 70-degree angles. Predicted fire solutions become useless when aircraft dive unpredictably, accelerate past 400 miles per hour, then vanish into low-altitude escape runs. Flak gunners fall back on barrage fire, filling airspace with explosive shells and hoping for random hits. It's inefficient, wasteful, but necessary against an opponent exploiting three-dimensional maneuver space. The human cost of this tactical evolution rarely appears in official reports. Between May and December 1943, 16 Typhoon pilots died during dive bombing operations. 7 from anti-aircraft fire. 4 from structural failure during recovery. Pilots who pushed past survivable limits or whose aircraft suffered material defects that manifested under extreme stress. 3 from pilot error, late pullouts, disorientation, target fixation. 2 from mid-air collisions during multi-aircraft attack runs. Each death generates an incident report. Each report circulates through the test pilot community. Beamont reads them all. He recognizes the patterns, the specific failure modes he documented, now manifesting in combat with fatal consequences. It's abstract knowledge made concrete. His survival enabled others to attempt similar maneuvers, and some of those attempts end in death. The moral calculus remains unchanged. 16 pilots died, but dive bombing capabilities enabled by test program data contributed to successful ground attacks that saved, estimates vary, between 200 and 800 Allied ground force lives. The ratio justifies the cost, at least in the arithmetic of warfare. Whether it justifies the cost in human terms depends on philosophical positions Beamont doesn't discuss publicly. In November 1943, the Air Ministry publishes revised tactical doctrine for fighter-bomber operations. The manual includes detailed procedures for high-angle dive attacks directly derived from Boscombe Down test data. Maximum recommended dive angle, 70 degrees. Maximum dive speed, 420 miles per hour. Minimum recovery altitude, 5,000 feet above target elevation. Recommended pull-out technique, smooth, progressive back pressure on control column. Avoid abrupt inputs that risk high-speed stall or structural overload. The manual includes a single-paragraph acknowledgement crediting test pilots for expanding operational knowledge of dive bombing limits. No names, no specific incidents, just general recognition that the doctrine rests on experimental data gathered at personal risk. Beamont's name appears nowhere. This is standard practice. Test pilots serve the collective capability, not individual recognition. By early 1944, American fighter-bomber pilots flying Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and North American P-51 Mustangs adopt similar tactics. The techniques cross the Atlantic through shared intelligence, joint training programs, and informal pilot-to-pilot exchange. American doctrine differs slightly: shallower dive angles, higher recovery altitudes, but the fundamental approach remains identical. Use gravity and velocity to improve bombing precision. Push the aircraft to its structural limits without exceeding them. Accept calculated risk in exchange for tactical effectiveness. Statistical analysis conducted post-war reveals measurable trends. In 1942, before systematic dive bombing adoption, Allied fighter bombers required an average of 12 sorties to destroy a single hardened target. By 1944, the average dropped to 4 sorties. The improvement represents fuel saved, pilot fatigue reduced, logistical burden decreased. The cumulative effect across thousands of missions, more targets destroyed with fewer resources expended. None of this data existed on May 11, 1943, when Beamont rolled into his 78-degree dive. He was testing an aircraft's limits, documenting control response, gathering data points. The broader tactical implications emerged later, derived from analysis distributed through doctrine, executed by pilots who never knew the specific incident that enabled their technique. Typhoon R-7881's remains, the stripped fuselage used for instructional purposes, survived the war and beyond. The aircraft is eventually transferred to the Royal Air Force Museum, where it resides in storage for decades. In 1982, museum staff discover Beamont's initials scratched into the instrument panel, barely visible, apparently carved during a maintenance inspection sometime after the May dive. The initials are preserved during restoration. Beamont himself continues test flying until 1945, accumulating data across dozens of aircraft types. He survives the war, transitions to civilian test flying, eventually becomes chief test pilot for English Electric, where he conducts first flights of the Lightning supersonic interceptor. He publishes memoirs in 1968. The book dedicates 3 pages to the May 1943 dive, factual, understated, devoid of drama. The incident that nearly killed him receives less attention than several routine test programs. In interviews late in life, Beamont consistently downplays personal heroism. He describes test flying as a technical profession requiring specific skills applied systematically. Courage is relevant, but secondary to competence. Survival depends on preparation, technique, and luck, in that order. The May dive, he insists, was not extraordinary. It was simply the day luck aligned favorably, But the data disagrees. Analysis of Beamont's flight parameters shows he operated beyond documented survivable limits for 7 seconds during recovery, too long for luck alone to explain survival. Something else was present: exceptional physical conditioning, unusual tolerance for G-forces, or possibly unconscious micro-adjustments to control inputs that optimal technique demanded but couldn't consciously calculate. Whatever combination of factors enabled survival, the result altered tactical air warfare permanently. Dive bombing transitioned from specialized technique requiring dedicated aircraft to standard capability expected of fighter bombers generally. The Typhoon proved that conventional fighters could dive like Stukas while retaining fighter-like speed and survivability. The doctrine spread to other aircraft, other air forces, other theaters. By war's end, the steep dive attack had become routine. What Beamont discovered at the edge of death had become something young pilots learned during training, practiced over ranges, executed over battlefields without recognizing they were performing a maneuver that once seemed impossible. That transformation, from fatal risk to standard technique, represents the test pilot's fundamental purpose: push boundaries, document findings, enable others to operate safely in territory previously marked unsurvivable. The 16 pilots who died learning these limits paid the immediate cost. The thousands who survived because doctrine incorporated their hard-learned lessons represent the deferred benefit. The calculus is brutal, honest, and unavoidable. Progress in aviation is measured in data points and tombstones, in expanded capabilities and closed caskets, in aircraft pushed until they break and pilots who push just short of breaking. Beamont's dive was both: a push that nearly broke everything, and a survival that proved breaking wasn't inevitable. The difference between those outcomes was narrow: seconds of altitude, pounds of control force, degrees of dive angle. But narrow differences, properly understood and documented, become margins that separate doctrine from disaster. That margin, purchased at 22,000 feet above the channel in May 1943, served Allied air forces for the remainder of the war and beyond. It serves them still. Modern fighter pilots executing dive attacks on precision targets fly with knowledge inherited from Beamont's 90-second descent toward certain death and improbable survival. The chain of learning connects across decades, across aircraft generations, across technological revolutions. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Someone, somewhere, had to be first. Someone had to dive past survivable limits and return to document what happened. Roland Beamont was that someone. May 11th, 1943 was that day. And the knowledge purchased in those 90 seconds continues propagating forward through every pilot who dives, trusts the aircraft to survive, and pulls out knowing the technique works because someone proved it possible when everyone believed it wasn't. There is a moment in every test pilot's career when the question becomes personal. Not whether the aircraft will survive, but whether survival matters more than knowledge. Beamont faced that question at 9,000 feet, when acceptance seemed rational and struggle seemed futile. He chose struggle, not from heroism, but from something more fundamental: a refusal to surrender data, to waste the dive, to let those 90 seconds pass without observation and memory. That choice, repeated across thousands of test flights by hundreds of pilots throughout aviation history, represents humanity's strangest bargain with progress. We advance by volunteering individuals to approach death systematically, to document the approach, to return with information that makes the next approach slightly safer. It is not brave in the conventional sense. It is methodical, clinical, almost coldly pragmatic. But it works. The dive that should have killed Roland Beamont instead expanded the boundaries of possible for every pilot who followed. Not because he was exceptional, though he was, but because he was present at the precise intersection of technology, technique, and circumstance that allowed survival and learning simultaneously. Another pilot, another aircraft, another day might have yielded different results, fatal results. But this pilot, this aircraft, this day produced knowledge, and knowledge once gained cannot be ungained. It propagates forward through doctrine, through training, through the collective capability of air forces that inherit tested limits without experiencing the testing. The pilots who died learning these limits paid in full. The pilots who survived because others learned first owe debts they cannot repay and likely do not recognize. This asymmetry defines progress: costs borne by few, benefits distributed to many, gratitude often absent because survival becomes expected rather than remarkable. 78 degrees, 490 miles per hour, 8,000 feet. These numbers mean nothing to most people. To pilots, they represent a map of survivable territory drawn in dive angles and altitudes, in control forces and recovery techniques. The map exists because someone descended into unmapped territory and returned to draw it. Every map begins this way, with exploration, with risk, with someone willing to proceed when prudence counsels retreat. The channel still stretches gray-blue beneath English skies. Aircraft still climb to altitude, still dive, still test the boundaries between flight and fall. The physics remain unchanged. Gravity still accelerates at 32 feet per second squared. Terminal velocity still approaches 550 miles per hour. Human bodies still black out under 7 Gs, but the knowledge has changed. We know now what we did not know then, that the dive can be survived, that control can be regained, that the boundary between life and death contains a narrow margin where technique matters. That margin exists because Roland Beamont found it, mapped it, and documented it so others might find it too. He lived to 83, dying peacefully in 2001, decades past the moment when death seemed certain and survival seemed impossible. The gap between expectation and outcome, measured in seconds during the dive, measured in decades across a life, represents the fundamental gift that test pilots offer civilization: time. Time for others to learn. Time for doctrine to spread. Time for the impossible to become routine. The Typhoon that carried him through that dive sits in a museum now, silent and static, its diving days finished. But the knowledge it generated continues diving still, through doctrine, through technique, through every pilot who pushes the stick forward and trusts that the aircraft and the technique and the accumulated wisdom of those who dived before will bring them home. They said no plane could survive that dive. One pilot proved them wrong, and in proving them wrong, he made survival possible for everyone who followed.